So as part of our clean energy series, I wanted to welcome Karl Rabago to the Southeast to talk to us a little bit about an interesting analytics that you're doing in Austin Energy about the value of solar. But first, tell us a little bit about your background, because you've been all through the energy industry over the years and been doing a lot of really innovative stuff on clean energy.
Yeah, thank you. I've had a chance to do a lot of fun things in the clean energy space, starting from when I got out of the Army. Shortly afterwards, I had a chance to become a public utility commissioner in the state of Texas back in the early days, and then have worked for organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund. I've worked for a couple of energy companies, Austin Energy most recently. We'll talk about that some more. AES Corporation, doing power and wind power development in a lot of countries, a lot of states around the country. I had a chance to serve at the Department of Energy, where I was led the renewable energy research and development programs that were there back during the Clinton administration. So I've had a chance to do almost everything there is to do in the electric space, and to watch a 20, at least in my experience, a 20-year evolution of this clean energy thing, from back in the old days when we were asking for set-asides and saying, you know, as your development plans move forward, have set-asides, to the point today where we are starting to understand just how valuable this resource is for utilities who are trying to ensure that they can maintain cost-effective, reliable energy services, not only today, but into the future.
So you and I were on a board of the Center for Resource Solution back years ago and worked together on some things. But you've caught my eye again, and some of the work you do in the Southeast. You testified in Virginia, you testified in Georgia, you on deck to testify in Louisiana and North Carolina, and you've been now working with us a little bit about TVA. So when you look at the national perspective, but then come to the Southeast, it's pretty clear that we're still struggling with really how to work with solar. So why is this value of solar proposition so important for a region like the Southeast to really get solar right?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's really balled up in a bigger concept that even carries over to traditional avoided cost kind of methodologies. And there's a whole major initiative working at the federal level through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on trying to get avoided costs right. It's also playing out in other states like California, places that you haven't even mentioned. But here's what it comes down to, is that distributed energy resources, and particularly what we're talking about is small-scale solar, is sort of a new beast. And it was easy to sort of treat it as one-off when it was very small and very expensive, and there wasn't much of it going on. But with falling costs and improvements in the technology, we're starting to see that this technology could become fairly common, that it's becoming much more available to people than was in the past. And utilities need to figure out what to do with it. They have a multi-decade tradition of evaluating large central station power plants and the infrastructure needed to get that power to the meter at our home or our business, but they have relatively little, virtually no experience dealing with this newfangled creature that can make electricity at the point where they usually only deliver it. So the utilities are not just delivering power, but they're possibly taking power, and it changes perhaps all the time during the day, and then it's being increasingly complemented by these distributed energy efficiency technologies. So bottom line of all that is, it is critically important that utilities understand what this resource is worth if they're going to make the best use of it.
Right. So we have basically a paradigm shift where the utilities used to build bigger, better, more efficient, larger plants. Now all of a sudden we have the falling cost of solar, and rooftops become power plants, and they're actually pushing it back onto the grid at the distribution level, and it completely changes the whole dynamic. But the utility really they don't seem to understand that and how to value that. So what did y'all do in Austin that was so unique?
The first thing we recognized is that it is what they call disruptive technology, but it's disruptive in character, not yet in fact, right? The amount of solar, the amount of demand response, the amount of these technologies that are in place right now are not doing anything to threaten the financial bottom line of utilities. We have room to learn, but we can start seeing it on the far distant horizon. And we know how hard it is to make changes in the utility sector, and customers don't like rapid changes in their service because electricity is vital, and they budget for it, and they plan for it. They don't want to be whipsawed around. Additionally, in Austin, we were trying to foster the emergence of a self-sustaining local solar industry. And that means that you also have to move in planned fashion, in which the businesses can organize around it, understand what's coming. So with
Sustained orderly development.
sustained orderly development is exactly the phrase and the mantra that we were using. So you use that as the context, and you say, okay, this new stuff's coming, and those are our design criteria. What are we going to do? Well, what we realized was that we were, I should say, a little segue, just a little bit of a context. Austin is the 11th largest city in the United States. About 1 million people served by Austin Energy, about 400,000 customer accounts. It has about a 2,500 megawatt system, so less than 1/10 the size of, say, TVA, or much smaller than any state, of course, but a pretty decent sized municipal utility owned by the people of Austin.
So it's a really interesting laboratory to try this out.
And
big enough to matter, but not so big that
right.
it's out of control.
And we have the benefit that if we saved money at the customer end, it translated all the way up through the system. If we saved money at the generation end, it translated all the way down to rates. So that was very good. We could see the direct value benefits of all the things we did at the top or the bottom end. Our solar was starting to take off. We had been nurturing the market for about 5 or 6 years. We had been starting to deal with the larger scale systems that were offering the power to us through purchase power agreements, PPAs. Back in around 2006, the utility commissioned an expert to help them just get a baseline. We didn't know what solar was worth, so we didn't know what we should pay. And that's a bad place for a utility to be. So we got an expert to help us. Well, what is it worth, and what services do we get from it? Well, we know we got energy, and everybody knows that from avoided cost. And we know we got some capacity value, but we knew we were getting more things, but we didn't know what the size of those were. And we also knew, by the way, that if all we paid for solar was the avoided energy, the avoided cost, nobody would build solar in Austin, because that number doesn't represent, we just knew that intuitively, that number doesn't represent the value. But how high above that avoided cost should you go? We didn't want to rip off our ratepayers either. So we commissioned this group to do the study originally just to benchmark the value of utility scale solar. Then when I came along to Austin Energy about 4 years ago now, I used it to check into our rebate levels. Because when you're doing rebates and incentives, it's another one of those Goldilocks things. You don't want to pay too much, because then you'll get these glut situations and feast and famine cycles. Likewise, you don't want to pay too little, because the market will just sit and stare at you, and all the jobs will go to some other community. So that was the second major use. The third use was when I had a chance to redesign our solar rate. And what I wanted to do was, let me just sort of pause and say, the goal of establishing a good residential or small-scale solar rate is to try to be fair to the solar customer, but to try to also be fair to the utility and the other customers. And that was critical. You've heard some things, people talking about how solar customers are being subsidized by other customers. The value analysis we had been doing for 6 years told us that wasn't true, that there was more value coming from those customers. So in fact it wasn't true, but it was growing in perception that it was. And there's some people beating that drum, so that didn't help. But we also had the problem that as solar was growing in popularity, our budgets for rebates and incentives, and yes, we were still paying incentives on top of the compensation value through net metering, but we wanted those budgets were getting strained, and we wanted them eventually to go away. Again, self-sustaining sort of market for solar in our community. So the first thing we said is, well, you know what? We ought to pay people fairly for the value they bring to solar. So this analysis that we've been doing for 6 years and updating every year for the cost of power became the perfect benchmark for the credit we should give customers on their bill for producing the solar. And that number was higher than our retail rate. But it also gave us a room, because we were treating solar customers fairly, to have a conversation with them about what a fair price would be for them receiving service at night, for the times when their solar system might not work. And that was that really just was a sort of a kind of a little p political dynamic. It turns out it's a lot easier to talk to people about paying their fair share if they feel they're being compensated for what they get. And it's a different dynamic for a utility at that end. So we use that value of solar calculation to set the fair compensation rate for distributed solar, That enabled us to set a fair compensation rate for the services they receive. And in the year and a half since we developed the rate, our rebates have dropped by over a third. The market has grown. Last year alone, Austin Energy put in 2.5 megawatts of distributed rooftop solar, and customers are happy and more enthusiastic about it. And the cost of solar in Austin is measurably lower than it is in surrounding communities because we created a more competitive, leaner, and more established market for solar there. So it's a good story.